Welcome to sunny side of San Diego.
It's the greatest city in the history of mankind. It's a fact.
Two local San Diegans that look at obstacles as an opportunity for growth.
If you don't fail, you're not even trying.
Michael Carini is the Acrylic Alchemist.
You can call me CEO
of Carini Arts. And Vicente, Vinnie, Enriquez.
No one could do it better.
The team lead of the Enriquez group.
Ride with us.
Hi, you sunny side of San Diego listeners. If you're watching us live right now, thank you for joining us. And you'll notice something new that we haven't done ever. We have a guest here, an exciting guest, and we're doing it on a weekend. And that's why I'm dressing down. So if you're watching us, you know, I mean, you're still important to me. Yet I'm wearing a t-shirt. So hopefully you won't hold that against me. This is our special for mental health. In May is something that we really try to focus on for mental health, and we're lucky to have Emily here. So thank you, Emily. And my co-host over here, Carini, always bringing wisdom and ideas for sunny San Diego. All right, hi, Emily.
Wisdom per se, but I share my experience, which is, I think, the valuable thing that all of us have to offer is our experience.
Well, talking about experience, Emily, why don't you tell us a little about your experience, who you are?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. My name is Emily Duval. I am a doctor of psychology in organization development. I am also a licensed professional clinical counselor in the state of California, so a psychotherapist. And I'm also accredited as a psychotherapist in the United Kingdom, where I lived for 10 years. I specialize in the subject matter of suicide postvention. So that is the aftermath of suicide for what specifically a population that we call survivors of suicide loss. I've been a therapist for 22 years or so. It is my second career. And I work in a county, but I also have private clients on the side as well. And I do some volunteer work with, I'm involved with the Suicide Prevention Council, co-chair of their subcommittee for suicide postvention, and just try to keep this subject as visible as possible. And of course, May is sort of our highlighted month to do that.
If I can jump in really fast, Michael, and I know, look like you're about to say something, but how does the UK compare to the US? Is there a difference of how they look at suicide, how they look at survivor suicide, things like that you're talking about? Is there a different way of looking at it, or is it fairly similar?
You know, I would say for that subject, it's fairly similar. It's okay. But culturally, there's a lot of nuances there. So that would be sort of a whole different show, probably. And I am a dual citizen. I have dual citizenship. So I lived over there for 10 years. But yeah, culturally, their approach even to psychology, psychotherapy, I feel is very different than what we have here. Because I was trained here, did my master's degree, and then moved over there and was pretty shocked at the standards or lack thereof there. So here, you know, psychotherapy is very standardized. Psychology is you need a license for it. That is not the case there. Anyway, but I did find my inroads into postvention there because, again, I already had specialized in that. Grief is handled slightly differently there. I would say culturally, it's a little more repressed. You know, I remember years before I immigrated, I was also a student there. This is in college. This is back like in 1992. And I had lost someone, not to suicide, but through sudden death. And I remember someone actually saying to me in a bar, Emily, grief is not for public places. So that stuck with me. And that was kind of just, I found that to be the case in the culture over the years too, when I lived there. But there is a very prominent organization there for survivors of suicide loss. It's called Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide. That I had some involvement with whilst I was there. But generally, no, I think there's certainly some universal elements that survivors share. And so there is a lot of overlap from there to here.
Yeah, I was excited when you and I first connected because this is a subject that is near and dear to me. And I use the term excitement in a rather peculiar way, perhaps. But the idea to be able to talk about it, because it is one of those things that not as many people as should feel comfortable talking about it, do feel comfortable talking about it. And I'm glad that there is a month that is dedicated to mental health awareness, but it's also unfortunate that we feel that we have to designate a month and we can't always feel open and comfortable talking about these things to help prevent them so that we don't get to a point of needing postvention. But in any case, we're likely always going to need to. And I, by no means, when I talk about these subjects on my platforms on a regular basis, I'm not a doctor. I'm not licensed. I'm just somebody that comes to the table with the life experience of being somebody that's faced the battles personally and have lost somebody because of it. So I feel like I do have this unique perspective in the sense that I've seen it from all angles. And it's one of those things that you don't ever really get over. It's something that you're always dealing with for the rest of your life. And I think that as a man too, and I can only speak as a man in this case, that I hear a lot of people when I engage that they find it intriguing or unusual or uncommon that I feel comfortable speaking about this and talking about these subjects, because I think that we have culturally built something up where men in particular are led to believe that they are not allowed to talk about mental health and their battles with these things, that you're supposed to push it down. And not to diminish women in any way, because I know that they deal with it. And a lot of times women feel like, hey, I need to suck this up and I just need to deal with this and I need to move on and I need to handle life and go on because that's what society and culture is telling me that we need to do.
Yeah, I think that's, I think in some cultures more than other ones where they try to suppress that idea of even talking about emotions. And this, suicide, what bigger emotion is there? I guess besides love. But yeah, I think in a lot of different cultures, and that's something that we've talked about a lot, kind of understanding or being okay with expressing your emotions. I know when I've gone through some very tough times, nothing suicide related, but very emotional times, even holding back those emotions, they wanted to come out. They wanted to come out. And there was moments where I cried and really kind of let myself go. And you're like, well, that's a sign of weakness right there. And you have to kind of remind yourself it's okay. Your body needs to let that stuff out. You need to let it go. And I think that's just something that we kind of grow up with. And, it's, over time, it's probably going to be more okay, more open. It seems like it's at least coming that direction. But I don't know. What do you think, Emily? Do you see a change from when you originally started to now about people being okay with the conversation?
For sure. Yeah. It's, I'd say, conversations are evolving, forms of expression are evolving, forms of therapy availability is evolving, certainly this past year, which was very hard and isolating for a lot of people, but some of them discovered therapy for the first time. And, something that, both of you said really was that these emotions, sometimes for men especially, there is a tendency perhaps to repress, sublimate, find other defense mechanisms, but all that stuff is going to manifest one way or another. So you can do it in those, you can do it, find a healthy way to do it, or it's going to come out somewhere or another. So, talk therapy, was invented and, it's certainly not the only form of therapy, but it does work for a lot of people. And yeah, no, it has definitely changed. Just even since I first, started studying to become a practitioner, and that was back in 1999. I've seen quite a difference just in the approach. But you know what? even in California, where we like to think we're so enlightened, and and I was from the Bay Area as well. It's still, I would say there's still a lot of stigma and even taboo around certain subjects, depending on, your age, your gender, the community that you're in. That there still are a lot of challenges with that, for sure.
And as somebody that faced and continues to face these issues, I have to say that in opening up and letting it out of me, it has created this release for me. And I have talked a lot about art as a tool for therapy. And during the pandemic in particular, I tried to, again, I'm not a licensed art therapist, but I know of the therapeutic effects of art and ways to teach it and generalize it for people of all ages and experience levels. And I found it to be a wonderful outlet. And as I was taking in everything going on during the pandemic, I was feeling like I was in this state because I felt like, as you mentioned, there are healthy outlets. And when I felt like my outlets were removed, my ability to go to the gym and manage my physical health, I felt my physical health, my mental health, and my emotional health slipping. And I was able to try to balance it a little bit with the art, but even that felt like it was falling short. And in falling short, I was thinking, geez, I don't know how much energy I have to do this, but I recognize the importance, because I have been through this battle and through these experiences, of doing the difficult thing of taking a day to myself to survive, because survive can be a means of progress to get to the next day. And then on that next day, taking a little baby step, doing a little bit more, but to try to share that experience in a public manner through socially distanced platforms and putting the art out there and showing other artists, other people that were struggling, hey, there is an opportunity here for you to work through the struggle and to find beauty in the pain and that struggle, to find a way to channel that energy. And so that's one of the things that I've still been focusing on, particularly this month. And even in the studio yesterday, I've been trying to shift to doing a lot of ASMR videos to help other people, but also to provide other people with an outlet regardless of their experience level, because you could just mix a little bit of paint, you can throw it on a palette, you can do something of that nature. And I'm telling you, the therapeutic effects, sometimes we just need that one thing that can give us that extra second to hold on a little bit longer to get to that point where we can reset and feel like, hey, okay, you know what, I can do this.
Yeah, I think having whatever outlet it might be. I mean, if it's, because we've talked about it. I mean, with the artwork is one outlet. Running, working out. Talking to someone, whatever that outlet is. But the worst thing you can do is holding it in and keeping it in. And I think it allows your mindset to wander too. Something that we've talked about, probably a lot of times, is I think most people have thought about the idea of life would be easier if I just, kill myself. I wasn't here anymore, right? And you start weighing yourself against other people. And I think with social media these days, and you start weighing yourself even more so, and you're like, oh, their life is so much better than mine. They don't have the pains that I had, because we only see that 10% of the positivity. And so if you don't allow yourself to talk and have these open dialogues, open conversations right there, you might actually start believing that your life is as horrible as you think it might be. But reality is, it's we all go through our struggles. We're all going through something. Some are bigger than others, but we're all going through something.
Now, one thing we haven't talked about before, and that you specialize in that is very unique, is this idea of postvention. So I want to dive more into that. And it's something that I've never really, I know what I've done for myself and what's worked for me, but I've never had a conversation with somebody about it.
And most people haven't. It is kind of a strange niche, but it is part of that sort of three-pronged effort around the phenomenon of suicide. But just to tie back to something you said, Michael, so when you're talking about, your grief experience and your, expression, the paradigm that I look at this type of loss by suicide is that for the journey of grief, it's an odyssey.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's not like other forms of grief. So if you've had other losses, sudden death or anticipated, whatever, yes, it can be traumatic and heartbreaking and horrendous. And I'm not, diminishing that. However, it's very different than loss by suicide. that is a very complex kind of loss and grief. And that is really why Postvention was developed. And it is, so to define it, it's just sort of, it sounds very academic, but it basically describes the activities that are intended to mitigate or lessen the painful impact of suicide. So it can be, that takes all kinds of forms as well. So it can be, consultations. It's also how media offers safe messaging when they're reporting on death by suicide, using the appropriate language. So that's probably one thing I should share, that if you may already be aware, in survivor circles, the preferred language is to say died by suicide. You still hear and sometimes read, the phrase committed suicide, which legally is correct. But for those in survivor circles, it sort of feels, it implies a sense of criminality. So hearing that is harsh. It's hard for survivors, I think. And there's, a few other expressions that survivors lean towards, I think, just for more sensitive language. So even just how we sort of model language is the way that we speak, is part of postvention. So for example, because there's a lot of firearm deaths. So in our county, firearm is the number one cause of method of suicide and death. So even just saying, using the word trigger, when people say, oh, well, what triggered him or her? That can be very traumatic for some people to hear that language. So we try to substitute that with activated, or some people will say, oh, this was a successful suicide, or, and then that sort of gives a mixed message as well. And again, the preferred language really there is died by suicide. So even those little details are part of postvention. So I would say that probably the leaders in coordinated efforts of postvention are schools.
And that's interesting.
And the military is catching up with that too.
I think that's really interesting, because as somebody that has been on the different sides of it, even I was not fully aware of that, but I know that in discussing it and talking about it, there are very few things that make me uncomfortable, and I don't necessarily feel uncomfortable addressing the situation or the experience I've had. But I do often struggle with the language of it. And when talking to my family about it, my aunt, it was my father in this case, and it was by firearm. But sometimes I just don't know the language to use, because even though I may be okay with something, I'm not sure with how she feels about it. Or you say something and you have a certain context or intent in the meaning. But as you mentioned, even the word trigger, triggering, like that, with my father, that being the means for his death by suicide, I can see why a lot of people are apprehensive to even broach the subject, because they figure, I don't even know what to say. I'm just going to zip my lips and keep my mouth shut. Yeah. And I know that I am always willing to be open and honest about it, but I can understand why it would be so difficult for other people to feel comfortable. And if it was me talking to somebody else that had an experience, even though I feel a certain level of comfort talking about my experience in a certain way, I don't know that I would feel comfortable using those terms, talking to them about their experience out of empathy and respect for their situation, the fact that it may have been very different. Because even though I've managed, and I use the term managed very loosely, even though I've managed my situation to the best of my ability and in a certain way, we all have very different and unique experiences in regards to this subject. And so it creates a very gray and murky area, even for someone such as myself, being on all ends of that spectrum.
Yeah. Murky is a good word. And because it really describes just the whole process, certainly in the aftermath of suicide, speaking for myself as a survivor of suicide loss, So going back to my loss that occurred in 1993, and I turned 21 that year. So, coincidentally, it will have been 28 years next Friday, May the 14th. So it sneaks up on you. It's interesting. But that's like a whole lifetime. It's a very long time in there. But, I think because the subject is obtuse, I think people do struggle with it. It's shocking. It's also something like a car crash that they kind of want to know about, but then they're scared. For me as a survivor, at the time, I just kept repeating the story. And I think for me, I came up with a narrative that sort of made sense. And I told this story to all my friends in college and stuff, people that I wanted to surround me. And I know that they sort of thought, Emily sounds like she's just reading something out of a book, because you're in shock too, for a while. There's that, it's very surreal. And that's the thing too about suicide, is that it sort of like those three words, does not compute. It goes against everything that, we do as we, throughout the day, is that, you have to breathe to live. The whole thing about our survival instinct, it just goes. For me, again, speaking, because I'm from, kind of a verbal family of origin, Italian sort of culture, where we're very expressive and we speak and
yes.
yeah. But no, others do struggle, and some people, like, it brings a great amount of shame, and they cannot speak those words. And professionally, over the years, I worked with survivors of suicide loss who spent years not in necessarily denial to themselves, but sort of public denial, about the manner of death being suicide. They just could not express that to other people. And then they'd show up in therapy, decades later and talk about that.
And it is an ocean of emotions too, because there will be times where I am completely okay with talking about it and I'm fine with talking about it. And then there are times that my mind state or my mindset is a place where maybe I'm not at my best and I'm much more vulnerable to the topic or the words or the language around it. And my case in this case is a very unique one, because my experience was that I struggled with these thoughts and ideas for much of my life, dating back to high school. I remember being on a high school retreat and getting up on stage after everyone sharing happy stories and talking about how that morning I had these thoughts of just, I'm done. And it wasn't until I was 28 that I had actually learned that my father's death was by suicide. So I had already gone through this period, and just months prior, I had been at the point of almost having the same end by the same method. And then just a few short months later, I find that out about my father. And so I'm trying to be as sensitive about this as possible, but it was a strange thing where there was this cathartic release of sorts that I can't even describe. And rather than, and I talked about this on some of my live feeds this weekend while I was doing my painting, it wasn't something that I think in many cases somebody will say, well, it's in my DNA, it's hereditary, this is supposed to be the way that it goes. But in a way, it kind of did the opposite. It said, it got me to stop and say, okay, this is how I've been feeling for all this time. And then I just learned this about my father, and I was rather calm and almost at peace about it. And it shifted my perspective of how I looked at it moving forward. And so I actually spent the next 5 years working on a tribute project for my father through my art, because my father never left a note. It was something that happened on my mom's 21st birthday. And so again, it's such a sensitive thing, because I had grown up having this certain relationship with my mom and a certain tension and animosity. And until I learned this, I could never fully appreciate my relationship with my mother, because I didn't realize that looking almost identical to my father, that she had to grow up looking watching her son, her first child, grow up that looks exactly like this person that she loved so much, but there was so much sadness around the situation too. So it really created a new bond with my mom. And there was no animosity for never being told by certain people what had actually happened. Perhaps it was best for me not to know until a certain point. And truth is that we're dealt with the hand that we're dealt. And you can only work with what you have. And so at that point forward, I said, okay, well, what are you going to do with this information? How are you going to choose to move forward? And I still have my struggles with it, but it was interesting to say the least in my case.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like it was validating for you in some way to know that your parent struggled with the same experience.
I think
so. You know, I don't know if that. Yeah, it was sort of like, okay, this is not only me. You know, even though it was a tragic end, it wasn't for you. But yeah, there's something kind of validating, but also sort of, I don't know, maybe another type of closure.
And just like you mentioned about language, though, that's exactly how I felt. But I felt so guilty with almost saying the word. I feel validated in my father's death because it wasn't like I'm happy about this, but there was this certain peace that it brought, like you just mentioned.
Yeah. You know what's interesting that kind of makes me think about is too, when people start talking about it, other survivors of suicide loss come out of the woodwork. It's amazing because, again, it's, you know, sort of a taboo. People think, whoa, you know, I don't want to bring that up. Or, you know, it's certainly not with a stranger, but, you know, things happen and, you know, people, you know, you meet strangers on airplanes or, you know, in the doctor's office or, you know, different situations in life. And then you just start chatting and then somehow you fumble into this and you find that you have this same connection that you're like, wow, I lost somebody to suicide. And, there's something in those moments too, that's sort of like a bond. You're like, okay, you know, you're in this club that nobody wants to be in. Yeah. You know, especially because they also vocalize. So they're, you know, you share and they share. It's sort of a mutual coming together of kind of identifying with each other's complex loss. And one experience I'll share that I had, so this was probably back in 2005. So I was living in the UK, I was married, and I lived in Wales at the time. And I went to an eye doctor, and the nurse was there, and she was asking me about myself because, you know, I had an accent when I lived there. And, oh, where are you from? You know, what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm a psychotherapist. And, you know, at that time I was, you know, more newly qualified and out of graduate school. And she said, oh, well, do you specialize in anything? And I said, well, actually, yes, I, you know, focused in the aftermath of suicide and sudden death and that type of loss. And she said, oh, really? And then she shared her loss. And I said, really? And then I shared mine. And, you know, she said something that I had been saying in my mind for years. She actually said it out loud. She said, you know, all these years later, you know, after, you know, processing and grieving, she said, I wouldn't say this to other people, but I could say it to you. She said, it's almost like my husband, her ex-husband, she said, it's almost like he gave me a gift. And people who have not been through this don't understand that because they think, what a horrible thing to say, right? But she's like, but no, in perspective, it gave me a gift because, you know, as much as he struggled and she grieved, you know, it changed the whole course of her life, as it did for mine too. And, you know, it gave me a different type of paradigm, worldview, empathy, you know, and a vision, you know, and a direction to go that I might not have gone in. So there are those moments where you can connect with somebody and say things that you might never say, you know, in other settings to other people.
It really does. And it does change the shift, like you mentioned, because I went from being somebody that was about me to realizing that there was more than me and that more people were affected by this. And so it is one of the reasons that I try to utilize the platforms that I have and whatever voice I may have or whatever voice I'm trying to find to help others find their own and to navigate their own struggles. Because I know what it's like to feel lost and to feel in that space from different sides of it. And I think that given this past year in the pandemic, as you mentioned earlier, I think that there were a lot of people thrust into this position that they had never experienced before. People never really having to deal with mental health issues, experiencing them for the first time and not knowing what to do. People that have previously dealt with mental health issues, either saying, hey, I've been through this before, maybe I can manage, or that maybe regressing and not being able to manage it to a certain point. And I think every end of the spectrum and everything in between. And I think that it was very under-addressed too. I think that it was something that was very much swept under the rug as a secondary or even a third level issue, given the pandemic at hand. And obviously, yes, that was a very serious issue. But I think what was diminished there was the long-term ramifications that are going to lead to the necessity of postvention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's another integral part of, I would say, the definition of postvention too, is that it is known to be prevention for the next generation. Because, so for every suicide loss, there is an estimated 6 survivors. So 6 people who were very close to that person. And then it has sort of a ripple effect, right? So it impacts other people, who knew the deceased in different ways. And for those survivors, they are much more likely to die by suicide. So just statistically, it doesn't mean that is how everybody reacts, but they are considered survivors are considered in a higher risk group. And then certainly coming back to my point earlier about schools and even militaries, in settings where you see that they have that like potential for clusters or the contagion effect. This is where postvention measures are so critical. And so for organizations, having the ability to actually plan in advance. And this is something that, I think a lot of organizations and individuals, but nobody wants to plan for this. For me, postvention is really like, you have to think of it as an insurance plan. And nobody wants to think that there's going to be a devastating earthquake, but you'd be really better off if you're prepared for it. Yeah. So
question. So you said that, so 6 people that are in that circle from someone that passes away from suicide, right? And the percentage for them to have suicide in their life. I would have thought maybe when it initially happens, right, the sadness of the suicide, maybe that might push you over the edge for possible suicide. Yet understanding, I guess, having that ripple effect of the suicide over time, saying, hey, look at the effects that this person had on my life. I mean, they took their life and I'm hurt so bad by it. Why would I want to put that same pain on someone else? So I could see, is there like any kind of studies that after the first year or after the 2 years where that percentage actually goes down drastically? Make sense?
There might be. I can't think of any particular research offhand about that. But I would say just because individuals have such varying, ranges of resilience factors, of, health, mental health capacities, it does vary by individual, because initially, a lot of times too, this is very surreal. So people are usually in shock for a long time. And there's also too, with families, I remember years and years ago reading and also having worked with a lot of families. So I used to be in what we call an SOS, Survivor Suicide Support Group facilitator. I did that in the early 2000s. And then again, when a little bit overseas, and then when I re-emigrated back. But families, there's kind of like a legacy effect. And this is part of sort of that stigma too, is this sense of well, this is my family legacy, and so my parent or my sibling or my grandparent has died by suicide. And for some, if they are struggling, you know, they have this sort of, that's in the back. You know, it's not ideal, but, you know, again,
it is. And then that's
Yeah.
what I was mentioning a minute ago. It's the idea, and that was the term that came to me, legacy. And I've even thought about that in the discussion of would I want kids? And that was a part of the conversation. Well, in theory, this something that is in my brain, there's a good chance that is going to be passed along, and they're going to have to, not to say that that's going to be the result, but they may have to fight this battle. And I know what it's been like to fight this battle, and I would never want anybody else to have to fight that battle, because I've seen what it does to others. I've seen what it does to me internally. And as strong and resilient as I have been able to be at times, I know that ultimately and we all do, we have a breaking point. And with the shifting of everything going on in the world that we live in, I think that it's getting easier and easier to get overwhelmed, which is another reason why I think we're seeing a increase in flux in the statistics, for assuming the statistics have any level of accuracy whatsoever, because I think that the statistics are somewhat askew by the fact that a lot of people don't talk about or acknowledge these things. So I think that the numbers are much higher than many would be led to believe.
Yeah, death by suicide globally is underreported, for sure. And also there are a lot of undetermined deaths, you know, declared by the CME that are probably suicide, but they don't have enough evidence to show that it was. So yeah, it's underreported for sure.
Well, can you tell us more about where people can find you, or what resources are available in terms of Postvention?
Sure. So, pardon me. Yeah, so there's a few things. So first, really just, you know, being May is Mental Health Month. Again, why do we need a month? This should be every day, all year. But for anybody who is concerned about someone, or they want to talk themselves, you know, locally we have the Access and Crisis line. So that's the 24/7 line, 888-724-7240. For those who want a source of information, just to educate yourself on sort of the three prongs again, so prevention, intervention, postvention. The resource I recommend is the American Association of Suicidology, and that's suicidology.org. And that really is probably the most comprehensive place where you're going to find facts and information. And they have various divisions of, you know, around prevention, and they have a survivor division, and it's just a very, that's just sort of my go-to. But also the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, so that's afsp.org, is another excellent resource to check out. And then they have additionally information resources if people are looking for something local. And then here again, regionally and locally in San Diego, there's the Survivors of Suicide Loss, SOSLSD.org. They are doing virtual groups at the moment. And that's the thing too about the situation we're in, is that now you don't have to be necessarily in the city where a group is offered, because you can join groups virtually. So that is a benefit. So my website is expattherapy.com. I have a list of resources that include some books and links, but particularly about loss by suicide for survivors. And then, you know, ways to get involved if people want to, you know, volunteer, find out what they can do. There's local chapters of the AFSP, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And this month they are doing a hike for hope. I'm involved in that. I have Team Postvention, and that's afsp.org. It's a nice kind of socially distanced way to just fundraise, and again, just create visibility for the subject. But But something I was too going to ask you, Michael, is if, in your process of, expression and art, is if you've thought of like doing a timeline, or do you have something like that? Just sort of a timeline of your own process and the type of art that you've expressed, and what that looks like if you sort of looked at that in aggregate, and what are your reflections on it?
In terms of with my experience and related to this subject?
Yeah. When you spoke about, having like your art being very therapeutic, I just wondered if, over time you had kind of looked at it as a whole, and what your reflections were on that. About the Odyssey, yeah.
In some ways, absolutely. I think that what I have to acknowledge in reviewing that is the fact that for the early parts of my journey, it was very much about me. So it was about me feeling like there was no place for me, feeling like I was lost. As a neurodivergent artist with Tourette's, I think that contributed to it, in addition to the other biological factors and life experiences. And so a lot of my work, even going through high school, we'd be doing things like self-portraits, and my self-portrait would be a very sad face that was crying. And from a very early age, people acknowledged the vulnerability in my work and the fact that I put it out there. But I think as children, we're all very vulnerable and honest about what we want to do, who we want to be, what we're experiencing. And we have it conditioned out of us by people telling us, hey, we can't talk about that. Hey, you can't be that. Hey, you should be this. It's more practical. And as somebody that's just always gone against the grain and was listed as the difficult person, I kind of just stayed the course. Now, when I shifted through different periods of my emotions, or different states where I was feeling more or less depressed, or closer to being at a point of suicide, there was definitely a shift in the energy of the work and the work that was being made. There were definitely lulls in the work being made. But then once I finished college and got a few years removed from college, it was, okay, now we're looking at this as a business. So at times I had to condition myself to sometimes working through the periods and maybe doing commission work, or work that didn't necessarily reflect how I felt. And I think that definitely shows when you're creating something that isn't how you feel. And so that was one of the big things I talked about during the pandemic was, hey, I don't really feel like creating right now. So I'm feeling very blue, very gray. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create some blue and gray pieces. I'm going to pull that blue and gray out of me. I'm going to access that blue throat chakra, and I'm going to pull it out of me so that it's not within me. At least I can kind of create some level of separation. And I found that helped a lot of people. The amount of messages that I got from people saying, hey, I'm going to message you this privately because I don't feel comfortable talking about this publicly, and I've never talked about this to anybody. It's amazing. Sometimes just being a regular person that talks about stuff makes people feel very welcome, because there's a level of connection and something that you can relate to, that of, hey, this isn't somebody that's being paid to listen to me. This is just a person that's talking, sharing their story. They don't have to. And I can safely, from a distance, socially distance, connect with this, even prior to social distancing. But I think social distancing really even added more to it. So from the comfort of one's own home, people can find something that they relate to and connect with. And so I think that sharing those experiences, sharing those new processes, there was a part of me that was doing it for me. But I think the majority of it, and moving forward, I think the majority of it is more for others. It's becoming less and less about me as I hit that point of learning about my father and realizing that it was about the fact that maybe my story isn't really about me at all. Maybe it's about the difference that I can make because of this. But I had to see that devastating piece of information that could have led me in one direction as an opportunity to prevent other people from feeling the same way. So I kind of had to sacrifice the ego in some capacities and humble myself in many ways, and realize that maybe there was a higher calling and a higher purpose for me, and that maybe that was it. And so 5 years working on that project that included painting the suicide note that my father never left. That suicide note that I painted was written through my hand, but through like our collective hearts and our collective eyes, because part of it talked about his life and his experience, and part of it was mine. It's like we were a piece of each other, but also separate entities at the same time. And so I felt like, hey, this gave me an opportunity to do something that I feel no other artist has ever done or will probably ever do again, because I don't know of anybody ever doing something like that. And then to put that on public display for 5 months, I think the level of vulnerability makes people realize, hey, maybe I'm not ready to be that vulnerable, but maybe I can open up a little bit. Maybe I can start a conversation. Maybe it's okay to talk about this. And I think it comes down to that, is just getting to a point of, hey, there's no harm in just having a little conversation. And you can choose who you have the conversation with. Maybe the conversation starts with yourself, but maybe I can say something that will get you to start having that conversation with yourself. And I may be in a certain mood right now. I may be very passionate and more on the manic side because things are going well for me right now. But I will say again, as a regular person, I'm going to have those points where I have my lows again, and I question the value of myself, the value of my life, the value of what I do. As I continue to be an artist that's in the public eye and very open about stuff, I'm essentially naked on a stage for people to judge. And I will continue to have people that hate on me and throw negative comments my way, because it's just the nature of life and people are going to do that. And so I've had to learn to condition myself. And that's a big part of why I tie together the art as a tool for therapy and bettering myself in addition to a business, but also the physical aspect. It's why I'm so into fitness. It's about the conditioning, the mental and emotional conditioning of the repetitions. And so in a way, every positive can be a negative, every negative can be a positive. And so the idea of being somebody with Tourette's and OCD tendencies, if I can shift the tendencies to be something more positive or something helpful. Addiction is addiction, but you can shift it in the direction of being something that can be helpful to you and to those around you.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I really get too from what you've said is a sense of congruence, is that you managed to find that congruence in your expression and matching what you express with how you're feeling. Like, hey, I'm feeling blue and gray. Blah, this is what I'm going to be expressing, in a whole context of feeling quite fragmented.
Yeah. And I think that there's a beauty in just honesty. So a lot of times I have a lot of kids and younger people, students that follow me, older people too, but a lot of younger people. And they talk about wanting to find their style. And I know that I'm talking in terms of art, but it really works across anything. And they talk about, essentially what they're talking about is finding their voice. And in order to find your voice, you have to be honest in what you are currently, what you could become, what you are feeling, and all the possibilities in the spectrum that surrounds you. And so if you're feeling a certain thing, don't deny what you're feeling. You have to acknowledge what you're feeling, and you have to work with that so that you can then get to the other parts of the spectrum and feeling those other things. But if you get jumbled up by holding in something that you're feeling, it's like that rock in your throat. And you feel trapped, and you may feel blue because you're not accessing that blue throat chakra and getting out what you need to get out. So sometimes you just need to say the thing you need to say, even though other people may not want to hear it.
It's a risk. Yeah. And that's what's great about, it's risk taking, because it's a risk either way. It's a risk if you hold it in, the risk to yourself and damaging. And it's a risk if you say it. But something too that I would just, as a comment on what we've talked about is that, grief is not a linear process. We're sort of taught on paper, that there's these 5 or 6 stages of grief. But I think it's really important to remember that it's not linear. People move all over the place. They have, times of, feeling like you're through the shock, and then you come back, even a year later, you're like, what? Did that happen? I mean, it's, and I think, a way that can sort of normalize it too is something I encourage is you can just go online and look for the grief wheel. Just type in grief wheel, and you can look for images and then get sort of a visual that is kind of a truer reflection of how people process grief, if it has to be on paper. But I think, what you've shared too really underscores what that looks like for people.
Yeah, it really
so thank you for sharing.
Back around, and I think it's important to let people know that that's okay. It doesn't mean that you're failing or that you're falling short or that you're not doing what you're supposed to do. It's the nature of life. I think that we've been led astray by, I think, a lot of false information and influencers that tell you that this is how it's supposed to be and good vibes only. And that's just not a real tangible reality for most people.
No. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think anyone that's listening right now, and I mean, I know Emily's already kind of brought up some platforms that you can look onto online, phone numbers and things like that. Definitely reach out if you're going through something right now. Realize you're not alone. Any last words that Michael or Carini want to add?
Last thing I want to say is that for those that want to dive into my world as I continue on my journey to find my voice and hopefully help others find their own, you can join me on my different social media platforms. You can go to cariniarts.com, scroll to the bottom, it'll show you my different platforms. I'm getting into doing more live feeds because I'm trying to be more accessible to people, and I'm going to talk about more things like this and the relationship to my work as I try to give people the tools to work with these things. But I am not certified, licensed. I'm just a dude on a journey and sharing my experience. But I think that that's a valuable thing that can help a lot of people. And it was nice to be able to connect with somebody, have a guest on, talk to a professional. And I'm curious what other things in closing she might want to say, because I think she brings a lot to the table and a lot to offer on this subject.
I think we, in the less than an hour that we've shared, I think we've covered a lot of territory. I think, both of you, thank you for, your contributions, your questions. And just, for me, the subject of postvention and the aftermath of suicide, again, this is very isolating for a lot of people who may not know, what's available, if there's anything available. But really just keeping it visible. I think just having the conversations is so important. And that's why I've kind of dedicated my life, the last 28 years since my loss to just keeping this in conversation. And that, yes, it's taking a risk, but you have to think about the risks that to you if you don't talk about it or find a way to express. So just, thank you so much for having me in the spirit of being community minded and, interested in talking about growth and reflection and insight. I thought this was a great experience, and I really value joining you today. So thank you for having me.
And yeah, thank you. And to end it on somewhat of a kind of a positive note, I'm really thank you for Nicole for interacting on the YouTube platform, watching us live. I'm really curious about your emojis and really bring that up. I feel like I'm looking at a cave wall right here, trying to understand the different emojis and what that all means. But I'm assuming it means a lot of love, and that you appreciate all the insight that Michael and Emily were able to bring. And thank you again for watching. Thank you, everyone that's listening to us later on. Please share, please subscribe, and of course, tell your friends, but also have that conversation if you need someone in this moment. Thanks, everyone.